To prove the reality of gravity, 2 elementary school students threw a brick off a building every day. This reckless behavior resulted in the death of a young boy who was struck by the falling brick. When they presented this absurd reasoning in court, the judge ruled they were not at fault. According to South Korean juvenile law, minors under the age of 14 cannot be criminally prosecuted. Consequently, just 3 minutes after the trial began, these 2 little devils were acquitted. What's even more terrifying is that they showed no remorse whatsoever. As they left the courthouse, they even smirked and sneered at the victim's mother. The juvenile protection law, originally intended to help rehabilitate misguided youth, became a protective charm for evil in this instance. The father of the unfortunate boy comforted his grieving wife. "The law is what it is, dear. You know the court's leniency is meant to protect children. But will constant forgiveness truly lead them to repent and change? The possibility is almost non-existent, because when faced with harsh reality, idealism is so fragile it shatters at the slightest touch." 5 years later, these 2 devils struck again. They drugged a young woman, took her to a deserted construction site, called 4 accomplices, and gang raped her. The tolerance shown for their crime 5 years prior had ultimately sown the seeds for the growth of evil. It wasn't until the next morning that Sean-ae, naked and unconscious, covered in bruises from the assault, was discovered by a construction worker. Luckily, the worker called the police in time, saving her life. Because she had been drugged, Siana only vaguely remembered the events of the previous night, recalling only that about 3 men had assaulted her. But before the police could even begin their investigation, Siana was subjected to relentless online harassment and vile cyberbullying. They insisted that the victim was to blame, that there's no smoke without fire. This drove Siana, already deeply traumatized, to the brink of suicide. Fortunately, her father found her in time and saved her life. Unable to contain his rage, he confronted Jun, the one who had lured his daughter out. Not only did the devil offer no apology, he brazenly claimed they had received Sean-ae's consent before engaging in consensual sex. They had initially considered a random roadside location, but, fearing discovery, chose the construction site to, in his words, confirm the order of operations. They even drew lots and took turns assaulting Sean-ae. Jun boasted to the father how his older brothers had played with his daughter in various positions before his own turn came. He claimed he was too drunk to perform and expressed regret that Sean-ae, despite being intoxicated, had resisted fiercely. The father called Jun crazy, but the boy remained smug, retorting, "You're her father, you wouldn't understand the pleasure we felt." Unable to restrain himself any longer, the father struck Jun. But because he assaulted a minor, he was jailed. Adding insult to injury, Jun's recorded confession was dismissed as coerced and deemed inadmissible in court. The case was eventually assigned to Yoon Seok, a juvenile court judge. Upon seeing Jun's name and personal information, Yoon Seok trembled. She was completely overwhelmed with emotion. Unable to stand any longer, she fainted. It turned out she was the mother who had lost her son 5 years earlier. After that farcical trial, Yoon Seok had resolved to become a juvenile court judge, dedicating her life to judging these devils disguised as angels. Now that she had finally achieved her goal, how could she easily let the perpetrator of the 5-year-old case go unpunished? Upon regaining consciousness, she immediately returned to the courthouse. According to Jun's one-sided testimony, he was merely following the orders of the other 2. Initially, they only intended to take Siana out for drinks and had no other intentions. Moreover, he claimed he didn't join in the assault on Siana and even tried to stop it, only to be verbally abused and slapped by the other 2. He then supposedly wandered around outside the construction site, waiting for them to emerge. The court subsequently announced that only the other 2 men's DNA was found on Sean-ae. They also readily confessed to their crime. Since they were over 14, they would be investigated and prosecuted under the Juvenile Criminal Code within a few days. But Yoon Seok doubted this outcome. She intended to discreetly investigate the truth, But her ex-husband from 5 years prior suddenly appeared. Yoon Seok thought he would help her, but instead, he threatened her with legal action, urging her to avoid involvement in the case due to her past relationship with the victim of the earlier incident. Yoon Seok coldly asked him, "What right do you have to interfere with my work? What does this have to do with you anymore?" Her ex-husband replied, "Because I'm her father. Are you trying to get revenge? What will that change? In the end, you'll be the one who gets hurt." But Yoon Seok remained resolute. "I don't care, just watch. In-jun will receive the harshest punishment." 3 days later, the trial began. Yoon Seok didn't immediately call the suspects but summoned In-jun instead. In addition to reiterating his previous testimony, In-jun now claimed he had been threatened by the older boys into assisting them, despite not wanting to. His lawyer presented photos of injuries on his body as evidence, arguing the case stemmed from an unequal power dynamic. He explained that In-jun knew Dong Jaeun and Jong Soo outside of school and had been forced to buy them cigarettes and alcohol for a long time, enduring beatings whenever he disobeyed. But Yoon Seok keenly noticed a contradiction in In-jun's statements. If he was so terrified of the older boys and always obeyed them, why did he dare to intervene on the night of the assault? Was it a sudden surge of conscience? In-jun was stunned into silence. Yoon Seok pressed further. "Why did you dare to disobey them only this time?" His lawyer jumped in to defend him, reiterating his fear of threats and beatings. But before she could finish, In-jun spoke up himself. He sobbed, claiming this act was simply unacceptable, questioning how fellow human beings could commit such a heinous crime. Anyone else might have been fooled by his seemingly innocent facade, but Yoon Seok knew this scoundrel's shameless true face. She gave In-jun one last chance to tell the truth, or face severe consequences. But the boy stubbornly refused to confess. Left with no other choice, Yoon Seok called a witness to the stand, the police officer in charge of the investigation. They had met 3 days prior. Suspecting further evidence existed beyond the perpetrator's DNA, Yoon Seok had visited the crime scene late at night. She encountered the construction site contractor who parked there every night and obtained dashcam footage from his car capturing the events of that night. The video showed the group drinking together and deliberately intoxicating Siana. After Siana passed out, the group erupted in vulgar laughter, preparing for their assault. The dashcam footage clearly recorded the scene. The truth was all three, including In-jun, took turns assaulting her. Furthermore, In-jun had acted with malicious intent, contrary to his initial testimony. He was finally cornered with no way to deny his involvement. His lawyer attempted to argue that the dashcam video could be fabricated. However, the police officer presented documentation from the court's video analysis department, confirming the video's authenticity and lack of manipulation. As a result of his false testimony, In-jun was deemed an accomplice and his case transferred to the Juvenile Criminal Court for reinvestigation. The investigation was to be completed within a week, followed by a sentencing hearing. However, before the hearing, Judge Tae-ju rushed in with alarming news. He had uncovered a new lead from another case. Another individual, Do-hyun, had participated in the gang rape. Yoon Seok was stunned into disbelief. Do-hyun was the other devil responsible for her son's death. The two devils had struck again together. This time, she would settle the score for the past 5 years, with interest. At that moment, a woman stormed in and slapped Yoon Seok across the face. "I warned you. I knew I'd find you. You can't hide forever." It was Yoon Seok's former mother-in-law. She viciously blamed Yoon Seok for her grandson's death, accusing her of neglecting her son for her work and calling her a destroyer of families, cursed to bring misfortune to her husband and child. Her son was finally ready to remarry, but Yoon Seok had reappeared, clinging to him. Seeing the woman's escalating, unreasonable tirade, Yoon Seok turned and walked away. Sitting in a corner, Yoon Seok listened to the echoing insults, her heart tearing apart. Even after her son's tragic death, she couldn't escape the torment. Her home felt empty, devoid of life. A needle, though small, can pierce the heart with excruciating pain. Words, though intangible, can inflict deep wounds. Her 5 years of suffering stemmed from a cause that now felt like a cruel joke. And in the eyes of these juvenile offenders, the entire case was indeed a joke. The mother-in-law's outburst at the courthouse exposed the 5-year-old case, and Judge Jun-hee learned the truth. Coincidentally, she was the judge who had acquitted the two devils 5 years prior. She still maintained her decision was correct, claiming any other judge would have ruled the same. Yoon Seok couldn't help but challenge her. Who is the law meant to serve? Is it designed to protect victims or perpetrators? If Jun-hee had imposed a proper punishment and issued a stern warning 5 years ago, instead of hastily concluding the trial in 3 minutes, today's tragedy might have been avoided. They learned nothing from the previous incident, believing themselves truly innocent. Seeing the loopholes in the law, they continued to harm more innocent people. Jun-hee clenched her fists. She knew Yoon Seok was right, but refused to admit her mistake, using Yoon Seok's relationship with the previous victim as an excuse to demand her non-involvement in the case. But Yoon Seok would never give up. She looked at Seon now, seeing her own son from years ago. She absolutely refused to allow the absurd judgment of the past to repeat itself. Fortunately, Judge Tae-ju had found a new lead in another sexual assault case. He'd happened to gather information from one of Do-hyun's victims, a young girl who was now pregnant. According to her testimony, In-jun and Do-hyun had formed a criminal gang, controlling numerous vulnerable young women, staging elaborate scams, and extorting money at cheap motels. Their reputation had spread. They blackmailed their clients by accusing them of assaulting their daughter. This tactic was incredibly effective. After each incident, the gang members made a lot of money. Some young women, blinded by the promise of easy money, willingly joined the gang. But they eventually realized they were just tools for the gang's profit. Not only did they not receive a share of the money, but their lives were threatened if they tried to escape the gang's control. So, they harbored resentment but dared not speak a word. This particular girl had managed to escape after In-jun's arrest. After grasping the situation, Yoon Seok acted swiftly. She relentlessly sought out the girls controlled by the criminal gang. She uncovered even more horrifying evidence of their crimes. It turned out that many girls who had tried to escape in the past were caught and brutally gang raped by these monsters. Moreover, the entire process was filmed. They not only used these videos to coerce the girls into prostitution, but also traded them illegally online. They were utterly devoid of humanity, not a shred of decency remaining. From the girls' accounts, Yoon Seok quickly learned the location of Do-hyun's hideout. Under the cover of darkness, she snuck in, intending to seize all the incriminating evidence stored on his computer. But just then, a figure suddenly appeared behind her. He asked abruptly who she was, whether she was a cop, then smirked. Yoon Seok realized he was Do-hyun. His smile vanished, replaced by a startled curse as he lunged at her. Yoon Seok furiously asked if he knew how much the contents of the computer were worth. He responded with a slap, showing no remorse for hitting a woman old enough to be his mother. Yoon Seok slowly rose, questioning him. If you were given a second chance, shouldn't you have lived a decent life? At least one of you two should have lived like a human being. Yoon Seok couldn't understand how he could live such a despicable life. But despite Yoon Seok's despair, Do-hyun sneered, grabbed her by the throat, and spat. "Who are you preaching to?" He then pulled out a knife, flipped her over, and pressed it against her shoulder without hesitation. He twisted the knife, asking, "Who are you, really?" Just as he was about to stab her again, Yoon Seok grabbed a nearby brick and smashed it against his head. Yoon Seok looked up at the shoe rack and spotted Seon A's other missing shoe from the assault scene. Do-hyun truly was an accomplice in the gang rape. The wall was covered with shoes displayed like trophies. Undoubtedly, each shoe represented another unfortunate victim. At that moment, Do-hyun approached, confirming his presence at the scene. He sneered, taunting Yoon Seok. "Now that you know the truth, what are you going to do?" He lunged at her again, murder flashing in his eyes. Just then, police sirens wailed outside. Yoon Seok had contacted the detectives in charge of the case. Do Hyun could only flee, but he was quickly apprehended by the police. All the evidence was seized. Refusing treatment, Yoon Seok, covered in blood, dragged herself back to the courthouse. She would use her own broken body to change Judge Joon-hee's verdict. She recounted their crimes to the judge, detailing how they had assaulted their victims and exploited them for profit. Seeing Yoon Seok collapse in pain, Judge Joon-hee urged her to leave and go to the hospital before she called an ambulance. But Yoon Seok, enduring the agony, pleaded, "Judge." Even the stern Judge Joon-hee was moved by this display. A week later, the court reconvened. The cunning lawyer continued her brazen defense of In-jun. She declared that since In-jun's DNA wasn't found in Seon-a's body, his guilt couldn't be proven. She then presented a fabricated certificate of good conduct, claiming In-jun was a diligent and helpful student. He had simply been threatened and therefore hadn't provided a detailed account to the police. The lawyer also produced photos of In-jun's previous injuries as further evidence. Do Hyun's defense was similar. Both defendants quickly shifted the blame onto their two younger accomplices. Clearly, the lawyer had meticulously researched the judge's previous cases. Based on Judge Joon-hee's history of swift verdicts, it seemed likely this case would also result in an acquittal. But Joon-hee remembered Yoon Seok's words. She played a recording of the two accomplices' confessions. Tae-ju had successfully persuaded them to betray their older counterparts. If all the existing evidence were used, Jong-soo and Dong Jaeon would likely be deemed the primary culprits, facing sentences of over 10 years. However, if they confessed truthfully, their cooperation could lead to reduced sentences. Hearing this, Jong-soo and Dong Jaeon confessed everything. Dong Jaeon affirmed that Do Hyun had orchestrated everything. Jong-soo added that Do Hyun would beat them if they disobeyed, mentioning that Dong Jaeon had also been abused by Do Hyun. Do Hyun's expression darkened in the courtroom. In-jun also began to show anger. Sensing trouble, their lawyer quickly objected, asserting that these were merely one-sided confessions without direct corroborating evidence. But they hadn't anticipated the younger accomplice's foresight. After each incident, they had secretly copied data onto a USB drive. Judge Joon-hee presented this incriminating evidence to the court, silencing Do Hyun and In-jun. Do Hyun stared at the photos, recalling how they had assaulted their victims, even taking pictures afterward as trophies. The victims' families wept with anguish as they witnessed this. Yet, even now, Do Hyun remained unrepentant. In-jun, sensing impending doom, completely broke down. He declared in court that all his actions were under Do Hyun's direction. Do Hyun immediately denied this. They erupted into a shouting match, resorting to violence, giving the judge no chance to intervene. They traded accusations, each exposing the other's crimes. At this point, the court's work was practically done. In-jun and Do Hyun had incriminated themselves. Judge Joon-hee addressed them no further. She wanted Seon-a, listening to the proceedings from outside, to conclude this trial. Seon-a hadn't wanted to testify, feeling too ashamed to face anyone, even contemplating suicide. However, Yoon Seok had persuaded her. She told her that the ones who should feel ashamed were the criminals, including In-jun and Do Hyun, and the online trolls who mocked her. They are the ones who deserve to die, she'd said. If victims destroy their own lives, it only emboldens these monsters. Only by facing them in court can Seon-a hold her head high and live with confidence again. And so, Seon-a bravely spoke at the trial. Trembling, she said, "Please give me my life back." The words seemed to take all the courage she possessed. As she finished, tears flowed uncontrollably. Her sobs reached the courtroom, filling everyone with anguish. Everyone except the two perpetrators. Finally, In-jun and Do Hyun were sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite the twists and turns of the case, justice had been served. But the scars they inflicted would never disappear. The victims would carry their pain for life. Yoon Seok, for example, had lived like a shell of a person for years. Although her son's killer had been punished, the grief buried deep within her now erupted. Looking at her son's belongings, she sobbed in agony, her heart breaking into pieces. After one last look at his photo, Yoon Seok took his belongings to a memorial and burned them, a final offering to her son in heaven. Her life had to go on. After this, Yoon Seok had no more unfinished business. She dedicated herself to juvenile criminal cases. The very next day, Yoon Seok received a shocking case of dismemberment that gripped the nation. A 13-year-old boy had lured an 8-year-old into his home, brutally assaulted and dismembered him, then discarded the body on the roof in the dead of night. Strangely, after the crime, he went to the police station and confessed to murder. The police were stunned. He then produced a blood-stained axe, claiming he had acted alone. Following his description, the police quickly found the victim's remains on the rooftop and immediately arrested him. The teenager, Shin Woo, lived in the same apartment building as the 8-year-old victim. They had never met and had no prior animosity, a clear case of malicious intent. The case quickly spread, capturing public attention. Because Shin Woo was under 14, under South Korea's juvenile protection laws, he would be exempt from criminal responsibility, facing at most 2 years in a juvenile detention center. This sparked public outrage and demands for the law's abolishment, demanding punishment for the perpetrator, a life for a life. Late at night, Yoon Seok reviewed Shin Woo's file. He had dropped out of middle school, had a record of multiple assaults, lived in a single-parent household, and suffered from severe bipolar disorder, requiring medication to remain stable. This could easily become his excuse. As Yoon Seok suspected, Shin Woo claimed a sudden relapse, stating he was in a confused state when the boy came to borrow his phone. Shin Woo, struggling to stay lucid, led the boy home. But drawn to the toys inside, the boy lingered, insisting Shin Woo play with him. Annoyed, Shin Woo finally snapped. He grabbed the boy and told him to play hide and seek. "If I haven't found you, you must stay hidden. If you come out or I find you, I'll kill you." Terrified, the boy hid under the bed. But Shin Woo found him. After a bout of chilling laughter, he committed the horrific crime. He then recounted the events in court with a disturbing relish, eliciting disgust and hatred. Aware of his age and immunity from criminal responsibility, he was defiant and arrogant. His lack of fear or remorse infuriated everyone present. When recess arrived, Shin Woo's mother sauntered in. She wasn't there to apologize, however. Instead, she immediately invoked juvenile protection laws, demanding leniency from the court. A foolish mother truly raises a spoiled child. Infuriated, Yoon Seok stood up and demanded that she apologize to the victim's family before discussing anything else. Soon after, the victim's mother arrived at the courthouse. Seeing her heartbreaking grief, Yoon Seok was moved to tears herself. The mother had no other request but for the perpetrator to receive appropriate punishment. Knowing the court couldn't accept gifts, she prepared some of her son's favorite dishes for Yoon Seok. That night, Yoon Seok ate the meal thoughtfully. The weight of her responsibility felt heavier than ever. She stayed up all night reviewing the case files. The next day, Shin Woo appeared in court again. He grew increasingly impatient with the judge's questions, seemingly eager to escape punishment quickly. He then presented medical records, feigning a worsening of his bipolar disorder. With a mental illness diagnosis and being under 14, Shin Woo was confident of victory. But upon seeing this, Yoon Seok scoffed, looked directly into Shin Woo's eyes, and said, "You're not the murderer, are you?" The night before, while reviewing the documents, she had noticed an inconsistency. Bipolar disorder typically presents symptoms like auditory and visual hallucinations. It's unlikely someone with this condition could carry out such complex actions alone, let alone maintain the focus required. It's even more improbable they could manage the necessary post-murder tasks. For instance, thoroughly cleaning the crime scene and expertly removing evidence, tasks even some adults would struggle with. Yet, he not only dismembered and cleaned up the scene, but also disposed of the body. This suggested the involvement of a third party at the scene, the true perpetrator. Shin Woo's arrogance, despite being under 14, suggested prior collusion and a deliberate confession. This wasn't mere speculation. Yoon Seok had reviewed the elevator camera footage where the incident occurred and found traces of a third party, a female student named Yi Yoon. Upon hearing this, Shin Woo lost his composure, yelling, "It wasn't her. She has nothing to do with this." But his outburst only confirmed Yoon Seok's suspicions. The court obtained their call logs as evidence, revealing frequent contact between Shin Woo and Yi Yoon before the incident. Shin Woo tried to snatch the photo, though he hadn't confessed to anything. The truth, however, had come to light. Shin Woo was taken into custody. Afterwards, Yoon Seok instructed Tae-ju to retrieve the police station's security footage. They discovered that when Shin Woo confessed, he kept looking in a specific direction. Standing opposite the police at that time was Yi Yoon. To apprehend her, Tae-ju first met with her former classmates, learning she frequented an all-night internet cafe every evening. Informed of this, Yoon Seok decided to act that very night. Unexpectedly, Shin Woo's mother intercepted them. She appeared distraught, demanding Yoon Seok release her son. But even pitiful people can be infuriating. If pleas or threats could absolve criminals, Yoon Seok's work would be meaningless. Unwilling to elaborate, she decisively started her car and drove off. Soon, Yoon Seok arrived at the internet cafe, located Yi Yoon, and identified herself. Yi Yoon stood up and cooperated, seemingly compliant. But upon reaching a turn, she suddenly broke free and ran with all her might. However, fleeing now was futile. After a frantic chase, Yi Yoon was cornered in a narrow alley. Yoon Seok looked at her with an impassive face and cold eyes. Her gaze conveyed an intense disapproval that would chill any juvenile delinquent. Yi Yoon had dropped out of school in 10th grade. Her busy parents, unwilling to waste time, hired an expensive lawyer to defend her. This highlighted a common theme. Behind a wayward minor often lies a pair of irresponsible parents. Facing Yoon Seok's sharp questioning, Yi Yoon maintained a facade of innocence, refusing to speak. Her lawyer had instructed her to invoke her right to remain silent. Even when presented with her chat logs, she stayed mute. Left with no other option, Yoon Seok showed the surveillance video from the day of the incident, asking why Yi Yoon was present near the crime scene. Yi Yoon faltered, clenching her hands and darting her eyes. She slowly replied that she had merely shared the elevator with Shin Woo, feigning naivety by asking, "Is that a crime?" Although Yi Yoon wouldn't confess, her presence at the scene was undeniable. Yoon Seok, citing Yi Yoon as a prime suspect, requested her detention. Yi Yoon's lawyer, however, quickly countered. The following day, she hired individuals to manipulate public opinion, disparaging the court and publicizing Yoon Seok's forced detention of a minor. They accused Yoon Seok of serious procedural violations and criticized her supposedly biased, negative view of juvenile offenders, claiming she was unfit to be a juvenile court judge. Upon hearing this, the chief judge of the juvenile court was furious. But Yoon Seok remained undaunted. She retorted, "At the very least, the court must uncover the truth. Isn't that our duty as law enforcement? What if, after the trial, the juvenile offender fails to understand the law and its importance? What are we, as law enforcement, supposed to do then? If the juvenile offender becomes even worse as an adult, hurting more people, who will bear the responsibility?" Yoon Seok insisted on showing these young offenders the consequences of their actions, educating them that hurting others comes at a steep price. If parents cared and wanted to protect their children, then families needed to cooperate with the court. Yoon Seok asserted that this was precisely why she was there. She challenged the chief judge, asking, "What exactly have I done wrong as a judge? What egregious crime have I committed?" The chief judge was silenced by Yoon Seok's righteous and pointed questions. He knew her words held truth, but he prioritized the court's reputation and the Ministry of Justice's image over admitting it publicly. Justice, however, resides within each individual. Reputation isn't built solely on online rhetoric, but on fair and transparent trials and judgments. Yoon Seok declared she would never easily forgive any juvenile delinquent. Yoon Seok then asked Tae-ju to visit Sung-woo's mother, informing her about the third person present at the crime scene. If she could persuade her son to confess, he would certainly receive leniency. Upon seeing a photo, Sung-woo's mother immediately recognized Yi-yoon. Though skeptical, she agreed for her son's sake. The trial date soon arrived. As expected, Sung-woo's arrogance had vanished. Standing before the court, he testified that he had acted on Yi-yoon's instructions. On the day of the incident, Yi-yoon had brought the boy to his house. Ultimately, it was Yi-yoon who committed the murder. He had only provided the location. Furthermore, he claimed to have been unaware of Yi-yoon's murderous intent beforehand. Horrified, Sung-woo exclaimed, "She's crazy, I don't know what to do." But Yi-yoon retorted, "We're both accomplices. We can both still live." Yi-yoon was blindsided by Sung-woo's betrayal. However, her lawyer had anticipated this. Sticking to their original narrative, the defense argued that Yi-yoon suffered from severe delusional disorder. Her psychiatrist even testified, explaining that this specific disorder, also known as persecutory delusional disorder, could lead to uncontrolled speech and actions. Even minor incidents could trigger episodes, resulting in uncontrollable rage and violence towards others. Therefore, her motive was difficult to ascertain. If Yi-yoon was experiencing a delusional episode during the murder, she couldn't be held accountable. However, a crucial question remained. Both Yi-yoon's delusional disorder and Sung-woo's bipolar disorder shared a characteristic: an inability to perform the complex tasks of dismemberment and cleaning the crime scene. So, who had done it? At this point, Yi-yoon suddenly named Sung-woo, claiming he had instructed her. He had stood outside the bathroom, guiding her on how to dismember the victim and dispose of the body parts in garbage bags. She had then climbed onto the rooftop water tank to discard the bags. It was all under Sung-woo's duress, she claimed. Sung-woo erupted, shouting that Yi-yoon had acted alone. She had assured him that she wouldn't be caught on camera. She was lying. Everything was her doing. He wasn't wrong, he insisted. But Yi-yoon continued to sob, maintaining that he had directed her from outside the bathroom. Sung-woo countered that she had suggested it. He had wanted to confess, but she had refused to listen. Afterward, Yi-yoon denied Sung-woo's accusations. Sung-woo insisted that she had personally chosen the axe. He claimed that after killing the boy, she even danced excitedly. Yi-yoon continued to berate Sung-woo, accusing him of slander. The two continued to blame each other, neither willing to admit fault. At this point, the victim's mother screamed for them both to be quiet. Her face etched with grief, she begged them to stop talking. Whether it was a victim mentality or a schizoaffective disorder, it didn't matter to the victim's parents. All she knew was that her son had been lured to their home by strangers and ultimately died in pain and despair without his mother by his side. Just thinking about it brought fresh waves of agony. She implored the entire court, including the presiding judge, to ensure that such a heartbreaking incident would never happen again, and to severely punish the perpetrators. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound the mother's agonizing cries. The presiding judge declared a recess. After conferring with his colleagues, he decided to follow Yoon Seok's recommendation, sentencing Yi-yoon to 20 years in prison, while Sung-woo would be sent to a juvenile detention center for 2 years. Upon hearing the verdict, Yi-yoon erupted, demanding a retrial. How could she be imprisoned for 20 years? She flew into a rage, lashing out at everyone and causing a commotion in the court. Sung-woo, on the other hand, hung his head, his face filled with remorse. Everyone knew that children like Yi-yoon were beyond redemption. Even after serving 20 years, she would likely continue to be a menace to society upon her release. This was an unfortunate aspect of the law. At the very least, the court had fulfilled its role, even if it couldn't change the nature of juvenile delinquents. However, the law shouldn't bear all the blame. If parents properly raised their children, such tragedies wouldn't occur. The fact that Yi-yoon's parents hadn't even shown up for the trial spoke volumes about their character. Without parental guidance, these children would never change. Rewinding to the time before the incident, Yi-yoon was sitting alone when a boy approached her, tapped her on the shoulder, and asked to borrow her phone. He wanted to call his mother. After he finished the call, a strange look flashed across Yi-yoon's face. It suggested a strained relationship with her own mother. Perhaps it was at that very moment that a sinister thought took root in Yi-yoon's mind. After the trial, Sung-woo's mother approached Judge Tae-ju, asserting that he had promised leniency. She demanded her son's immediate release. Exasperated by her imperious attitude, Yoon Seok finally spoke up, stating that Sung-woo's sentence was already lenient. If she wasn't satisfied, she could appeal. In that case, Yoon Seok would reconsider and potentially increase the sentence. Yoon Seok then told her about the idiom, N letter 187 I Dao D stroke letter 189 RU letter 189T, which describes the gut-wrenching pain of losing a child. She told her to endure it. She asked what Sung-woo's mother had been doing for him when he was 9 years old. The victim of this case was also only 9. His mother had lost her son forever, all because of her son. Yoon Seok's words deeply affected Sung-woo's mother. Late that night, back at home, looking at the dent still on her floor, she finally understood the pain. The crime committed could never be erased. Regret now was too late. Although the shocking murder and dismemberment case had concluded, it didn't mean everything was over. Had these juvenile offenders truly repented for their crimes? Would they re-offend during their rehabilitation? There were no guarantees. The next day, the court received an unexpected call regarding the Juvenile Detention Center, alleging that the director was suspected of embezzling funds and abusing the children. Upon receiving this news, Yoon Seok and Tae-ju immediately went to the detention center to investigate. They questioned the young girls one by one. The results were horrifying. Each of them had suffered various levels of abuse. For instance, at mealtimes, the director would serve them leftover rice, while her own daughter ate freshly cooked meals. If anyone dared to complain, she would throw their bowl on the floor, saying, "The likes of you wouldn't even have rice to eat at home, and you dare to be picky." Then, she would refuse them food altogether. The girls would have to apologize, promising to be more polite and beg for food. But she would retort, "Aren't you full already? If you're full, go to your room and rest." If the girl continued to cry, she would be verbally abused further, with the director shouting, "Don't cry, it brings me bad luck. If you keep crying, I won't be lenient." The director would then order the girl upstairs, crying and bringing bad luck first thing in the morning. What a sight. Moreover, they were forced to work as domestic servants in the homes of local residents to generate income for the center. Any resistance was met with brutal beatings. One girl had even suffered a broken bone and was still hospitalized. While these juvenile offenders were sent there for rehabilitation, this treatment was beyond excessive. Yoon Seok and Tae-ju immediately investigated the detention center's financial records throughout the night, quickly finding evidence of the director's embezzlement. The next day, they called her in for questioning. However, she presented a story that completely contradicted the testimonies of the juvenile offenders. She claimed that she had been diligently caring for them all along. But the girls were unsatisfied, constantly demanding to smoke cigarettes during meals. After she refused this outrageous request, they verbally abused her and smashed the dishes on the table. She asked them what they thought they were doing and whether they didn't appreciate having food. One girl retorted sarcastically, "Is she trying to say that the likes of us wouldn't even have rice to eat at home, and now we dare to be picky?" The director warned them not to look at her like that, as her patience had limits. The girl then declared she wouldn't eat, kicking her chair over as she stormed off. The director told her not to eat, saying she didn't deserve to. At this point, the director's daughter, Kim Ah, stood up and asked why they were making such a commotion so early in the morning. The other girls mimicked Kim Ah and burst into laughter. The director, unable to do anything, silently cleaned up the mess. Regarding the forced domestic work, there was apparently a reason for that too. When the detention center was first established, there was strong opposition from local residents who didn't want juvenile delinquents in their community. To ease tensions, the director personally took the girls to help with chores in residents' homes. She also organized group activities to try and change public perception. However, old habits die hard, and the girls continued to form cliques, bullying those who showed remorse and were trying to reform. They even went so far as to break one girl's leg. To verify the director's claims, Yoon Seok brought the girls into her office and then called the hospital. The truth finally emerged. Kindness, it seemed, couldn't reform evil. These juvenile delinquents needed strict punishment to instill a deep-seated fear of the law. Later, Yoon Seok visited the injured girl in the hospital and discovered that the director had embezzled the funds not for personal gain, but to pay for the girl's medical expenses. The director had been too optimistic about the girl's capacity for change. She knew that if the truth came out, they would face further legal consequences, so she had secretly embezzled the funds. The girl said that after being discharged, she would work hard to repay the money and begged Yoon Seok not to close the detention center. She considered it her home and the director as her mother. It was at the detention center that she first experienced the feeling of being loved and cared for, of having someone put food in her bowl. She vowed to live a good life after completing her rehabilitation and had a new goal: to repay the director's kindness. Realizing she had misjudged the director, Yoon Seok immediately drove to the juvenile detention center that night, only to find it in a state of disarray. It appeared a fight had broken out. Moreover, the juvenile offenders and the director were missing. Only the director's daughter, Kim Ah, remained. Yoon Seok asked what had happened. Kim Ah explained that her mother had just been taken away in an ambulance. Yoon Seok was shocked. It turned out that upon learning the detention center was facing closure, the director had collapsed. Kim Ah, distraught, believed the juvenile delinquents were responsible for her mother's condition. She even blamed them for her absent father. Her mother had told her that her father was working overseas and couldn't return, but it was a lie. Her parents had long been divorced. Her mother clung to the detention center, to this failing institution, because of these delinquent girls. A few days prior, Kim Ah's younger sister had been hospitalized with severe menstrual cramps, yet her mother hadn't gone to see her. Feeding the delinquents had taken priority over her own daughter in the hospital. It seemed her mother always prioritized others over her own children. Yoon Seok then realized that it was Kim Ah, not the delinquents, who had made the initial complaint. She had wanted to use the situation to shut down the detention center for her mother's sake. Fortunately, the director was going to be all right, but the juvenile offenders had taken the opportunity to escape. Free from constraints, the seeds of evil within them were about to sprout once more. Everyone rushed to the nearest police station to report the escape and then split into groups to search for them. Just then, one of the escaped girls unexpectedly contacted them. She revealed that another girl, Young Na, was forcing the others into prostitution at a motel. Mid-conversation, Young Na suddenly appeared and grabbed the girl. Upon receiving this news, Yoon Seok's team immediately mobilized. However, the girl was now locked in a motel room, with Young Na standing guard downstairs. The girl tried to escape when a man entered the room and, without a word, chained the door shut. She asked him what he was doing. He turned, calmly explaining that too many girls took the money and ran, so he had to take precautions. While he was showering, the girl frantically searched his bag for the key, only to recoil in horror. The bag contained nothing but sex toys, not even a wallet. The girl then tried to unlock the man's phone to call the police. But just then, the shower stopped. The man, assuming she was trying to trick him, began to beat her, accusing her of trying to steal his money. Fortunately, Yoon Seok arrived with the police to search the motel. They checked each room one by one. Inside the room, the girl smashed a bottle, threatening to kill herself if the man came any closer, telling him he'd go to jail. Unfazed, the man taunted her, daring her to do it. At that moment, a voice called from outside. "Police, open up." The girl screamed for help. His crime about to be exposed, the man flew into a rage and tried to strangle her. Hearing the commotion, the police outside broke down the door just in time. The man attempted to escape through the window but was immediately apprehended. Eventually, all the other girls were found, but young Na was still missing. After questioning the girls, the police learned that Kim Ah, knowing young Na's deep attachment to her mother, had lied and told her that her mother was critically ill. Yoon Seok and the director went to young Na's mother's address and quickly found young Na sitting on the stairs, covered in blood and clearly distraught. It turned out that young Na had indeed gone to see her mother the previous night, but her mother was not ill. Instead, she had found a new boyfriend and showed open disdain for young Na, even though she was her own daughter. Having grown up in a broken home with a neglectful mother, young Na craved love and envied children with supportive parents. Her mother's attitude pushed her over the edge, turning love into hate. She frantically banged on the door, calling for her mother. A man opened the door, asking who she was. Young Na tried to force her way inside, but the man stopped her, calling her crazy. Young Na's mother watched her daughter being assaulted by her boyfriend without intervening, even turning away. Hurt children often resort to self-destructive behavior and are more likely to commit crimes or associate with criminals, ultimately becoming offenders themselves. Deep down, they know their actions are wrong, but they continue to offend, hoping their self-inflicted pain will also hurt their loved ones. This was true for the other girls, and for Kim Ah as well. Their goal was simple: to get the attention of adults, to acknowledge their pain, and to hope they wouldn't be ignored. But their cries for help went unanswered. In reality, the majority of criminal acts stem from family circumstances. Courts and juvenile detention centers only offer support. The biggest reason for juvenile delinquency is a lack of love and affection, and this problem will never truly be solved. Parents who have experienced a lifetime of failures are often the ones who feel entitled to be absolutely authoritarian with their children. As a result, some adults simply don't know how to love others. Yoon Seok hopes the director will learn from this incident and not wait until his own daughter becomes a juvenile delinquent to regret his actions. The director recovered and returned home to his daughter. He called her name and embraced her shoulders, saying, "I'm so tired, give me a hug." His daughter smiled happily, but still feigned a little sulkiness. Father and daughter had reached an understanding, and their bond grew stronger. Meanwhile, back at the juvenile court, after a discussion during their break, they decided to keep the juvenile detention center open. However, the bullying incident and young Na's case couldn't be ignored. The next day, the juvenile delinquents were gathered to hear their sentences. Each was sent to more strict juvenile correctional facilities for rehabilitation. Moreover, this time, their parents were also required to undergo educational rehabilitation alongside them, especially young Na's parents or guardians. Everyone hung their heads low, sitting together in the back, seemingly ashamed. But were they ashamed of their children or ashamed of their own failure to raise them properly? While difficult to discern, judging by their demeanor in court, the concept of shame seemed largely absent. The judgment was delivered. At the same time, the chief judge summoned the presiding judge of the juvenile court to his office. Recently, there had been an exam leak at a prestigious high school. The students involved were all from elite families, including children of influential political figures and government officials. It was a complex and sensitive case involving a large group. The chief judge entrusted the presiding judge with full authority to handle it. The presiding judge accepted, intending to resign after this case to enter politics. He had long dreamt of reforming juvenile law, something he believed he could only achieve as a legislator. This case would be his last. Confident, the presiding judge left the office, only to receive a call from the police. His own son was so terrified he wouldn't open the door. It turned out he was involved in the exam leak. Remembering his promise to the chief judge, the presiding judge returned home furious. Fortunately, the police weren't there about the leak, but to investigate a recent traffic accident. The presiding judge raged, throwing and breaking things. He had explicitly forbidden his wife and son from getting involved. His wife insisted their son had only participated once and then stopped. Besides, many others were involved. Only the principal knew the full list. With so many involved, she reasoned, surely nothing would happen. But with public attention focused on the incident, Judge Kang knew it wasn't that simple. Exposure would ruin his son's future and his own career. He angrily confronted his son, reminding him of the warnings and the explicit prohibition. Why had he disobeyed? He felt powerless, resigned to the seemingly inevitable consequences. His wife, now realizing the gravity of the situation, wailed in despair, lamenting that she had destroyed her husband's and son's futures. The next day, news of the exam leak hit the headlines. Judge Kang's political aspirations were also publicly announced. However, his son, Shin Woo, unwilling to tarnish his father's reputation, ran to the police station, prepared to confess. Late that evening, after Judge Kang had dinner with the assemblyman, he received a call from the police. Shin Woo had been seriously injured in a traffic accident while crossing the street and was in critical condition. Looking at his unconscious son and his sobbing wife, Judge Kang felt an overwhelming emptiness. He recalled scolding his son earlier, telling him to go on his own and not drag others down with him. His wife blamed him for everything. It turned out that Judge Kang had constantly compared Shin Woo to his second son, berating him for his poor academic performance, for being a judge's son who consistently ranked last, a source of great shame for him. This constant pressure weighed heavily on Shin Woo. Desperate for his father's approval, he studied diligently every day, but his grades didn't improve. Knowing he was the judge's son, the school had proactively invited him to participate in the exam leak, leading to his single transgression. Overwhelmed with guilt afterward, Shin Woo withdrew and didn't participate further. At his core, he was a good kid. Judge Kang had been completely oblivious to all of this. Finally, he recognized his own failings. He then went to the assemblyman to withdraw from the election, but was refused. For Korean politicians, such incidents were commonplace, even considered trivial. Withdrawing now would only attract more media scrutiny. The assemblyman demanded a swift resolution. Judge Kang then secretly met with the prosecutor in charge of the exam leak case, instructing him to deny everything in court the next day. Initially confused, the prosecutor only understood when he saw Judge Kang presiding over the trial. Not only did the students and the school deny the charges, but even the parents argued that leaking exam questions was perfectly normal. One parent stood and explained, in the past, diligent study was enough to get into Seoul National University. But now, simply attending school isn't sufficient. Parents must spend exorbitant amounts of money hiring graduate students as tutors, and their children endure countless practice exams and assessments. Yoon Seok, astonished, asked why not simply refuse and let the children learn normally. The parent continued, explaining that the college entrance exam is a battlefield, and they consented to the scheme for their child's benefit. Refusal would only mean another child taking their place in the rankings. Even a point or two could mean the difference between being first and being 10th. The parent emphasized that these children weren't receiving the answers because they were poor students, but because they needed to dedicate time to other subjects, preparing for the brutal, life-or-death struggle that is the college entrance exam. Those present in the courtroom were speechless. The parent, growing more agitated and indignant, demanded to know when the proceedings would end, as their child had a tutoring session to attend. They seemed utterly devoid of remorse. Judge Kang swiftly concluded the preliminary hearing, using his authority to release all witnesses. Yoon Seok, perplexed, questioned this decision. The judge, enraged, accused her of overstepping her bounds, threatening to resign if she continued. This reaction alerted Yoon Seok to something amiss. A few days later, the trial resumed. Unexpectedly, a student revealed a crucial clue. He had overheard the principal calling the prosecutor, stating that 24 students were initially involved in the leak, but the number had been reduced to 21, leaving 3 unaccounted for. He hadn't heard specific names. Undoubtedly, these three were children of influential figures, perhaps even high-achieving students. Based on the previous parental testimonies, these students weren't seeking higher scores, but rather saving time on tutoring, or perhaps they had withdrawn from the scheme midway. Following this lead, Yoon Seok identified 6 students fitting the criteria. Among them was Shin Woo, Judge Kang's son. Her suspicions seemed confirmed, but concrete evidence remained elusive. At the third trial, Chief Judge Kang seemed even more impatient. He immediately announced that the proceedings would be expedited and all requests for witnesses were denied. The prosecutor argued that there was no justifiable reason to refuse crucial witnesses, but Chief Judge Kang remained firm in his denial. Finally, Yoon Seok couldn't take it anymore and declared a recess, even stating that because the chief judge wasn't following proper procedure, an hour was needed to regroup. This surprised everyone. Afterward, she was reprimanded by Chief Judge Kang for overstepping her authority. Seeing this, Yoon Seok resolutely revealed Shin Woo's involvement. Chief Judge Kang, clearly struck a nerve, loudly shouted that there was no evidence. He threatened her, saying if she relied solely on speculation and conjecture, he would use every means to retaliate. The two then parted ways in discord. Unexpectedly, the next day, Yoon Seok reported the incident to the presiding judge. Chief Judge Kang tried to make excuses, but Yoon Seok had brought evidence. It turned out she had visited Shin Woo, who had recently regained consciousness. That day, the boy had intended to turn himself in, but suddenly felt that doing so would negatively impact his father, leading him to make such a foolish decision. He thought that if he died, everything would be over. Yoon Seok convinced him that everyone makes mistakes, but the important thing is to take corrective action afterward. These words deeply affected Shin Woo, and he finally confessed everything. Yoon Seok presented the evidence before everyone, leaving Chief Judge Kang speechless. The presiding judge gave him 1 day to pack his belongings and resign. However, this doesn't necessarily mean Chief Judge Kang was a bad person. His goal was to enter politics and reform juvenile law. He wanted to use a wrong method to achieve a just outcome. This is a classic example of utilitarianism. Whether utilitarianism is right or wrong must be determined by contrasting it with idealism. The result of idealism, in this case, was forcing a potentially influential figure in the judicial system to resign, causing the public to doubt the court's credibility, and bringing a stable organization to a standstill. If everyone had to be perfect, without a single flaw or mistake, then everyone would constantly be scrutinizing themselves. Ultimately, in such a society, everyone would only live for themselves, and no one would dare to speak up for justice. But justice will always prevail, because in any system, good people and capable people need to work together to achieve greater results. Currently, a capable person like Chief Judge Kang has had to entrust the task of legal reform to a good person like Yoon Seok. As the final trial took place, he quietly slipped away. Only Judge Tae-ju was there to see him off, and he produced a photograph. It turned out that he, too, had once been a juvenile offender, one of the many who had received Chief Judge Kang's help. He began to recount his first day on the job. The chief judge admitted he had recognized him from their first meeting and expressed his deep gratitude for Tae-ju becoming a good person. At that moment, Judge Tae-ju bent down and tied Chief Judge Kang's shoelaces, just as the chief judge had done for him when he was a young offender. He would never forget the chief judge's demeanor at that time, seemingly always remembering his kindness and support. The two said their goodbyes. Finally, with emotion, the chief judge reminded him to always follow the path of righteousness and not make the same mistakes he had. Then he left. Judge Tae-ju bowed one last time to Chief Judge Kang, showing his respect and reverence. Chief Judge Kang left a letter for Yoon Seok. In it, he wrote that he didn't actually hate her, only felt some anger at times. He acknowledged that Yoon Seok's words weren't wrong, and her actions even less so. He hoped she would continue to be a good judge and carry on his unfinished work, reforming juvenile law in the future. The outcome, he wrote, was up to fate. Just like the current juvenile justice system in South Korea, no one could offer a perfect solution. But until then, leniency under the law would be tantamount to condoning crime, because the behavior of minors is easily influenced by external factors. They are like polluted puddles, unable to cleanse themselves. If society cannot punish them, then the law must. And Yoon Seok would be the judge to use the law to do just that.